By spring of 1945, the 8th Princess Louise's New Brunswick Hussars had spent 3.5 years overseas. In that time they had travelled from the thatched cottages and country houses of England to the sandy plains of North Africa. They'd fought their way up the entire Italian peninsula in a brutal campaign that had cost many lives, before participating, along with many other Canadian units, in the liberation of the Netherlands. The Dutch had been suffering under the German yoke since 1940, when the Wehrmacht steamrolled the ill-prepared Royal Dutch Army in a matter of days. After the port city of Rotterdam was completely leveled by the bombers of the Luftwaffe, the kingdom surrendered to the invaders, who proceeded to subject its citizens to a brutal 5-year occupation. The Dutch were forced to work in German factories and conscripted into constructing the Atlantic Wall that served to defend Europe from Allied invasion and keep the Netherlands under Hitler's rule. They lived in constant fear of German soldiers and their Dutch collaborators that aided in their subjugation of the country, who, it is said, governed the Netherlands like a feudal province. Nearly 3/4 of all Dutch Jews were killed by the Nazi regime, a higher percentage than any other country in Western Europe. As the occupation wore on, conditions only grew worse and worse. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was a particularly harsh one, and widespread food shortages led to a devastating famine, such that it became known in Dutch as the Hongerwinter, or Hungry Winter. Such hardships were only alleviated by the arrival of Allied troops in the spring of 1945, among whom were the 8th Hussars. The Hussars arrived in the Netherlands in early April. By then the war was nearly over, and it was just over a month before Nazi Germany capitulated and a ceasefire was declared. When at last the message came down from Allied command to cancel all offensive operations, there was much relief and jubilation throughout the regiment, and indeed the entire army, that the bloody conflict in which so many had died had finally come to a close. The end of the war, however, did not mean the end of the 8th Hussars and their deployment overseas. After hostilities with Germany ceased, the regiment was stationed in the village of Eelde, a few miles south of the city of Groningen in the northeast of the Netherlands. In many ways, the Hussars were fortunate to be stationed in Dutch lands rather than in those of their erstwhile enemy. In the latter, they would have come as occupiers, reminders to the Germans of their recent defeat. In the former, they came as liberators, and were regarded as such by the grateful people of Eelde, who showed their immense gratitude in many ways. The kindness of the people of Eelde, who until recently had suffered so much under German rule, was greatly appreciated by the 8th Hussars, and the men of the regiment did their best to repay that which the Dutch did to them. Oftentimes, the men would help the villagers transport peat from the bogs, which was used to heat their homes. Driver maintenance exercises would be scheduled out in the countryside around Eelde, where the blocks of peat had been stacked. They would be loaded up in the regiment's trucks, and when the exercises were complete, they would bring the peat back to the village square, where it was distributed to the populace. This sort of reciprocal generosity laid the foundation for a strong and enduring friendship between the men of the 8th Hussars and the people of Eelde. In the little Dutch village, a lively social life blossomed, with all sorts of clubs and societies enjoyed by Hussar and local alike. Dances were frequent, as were sporting events. The regiment even began publishing a newspaper, the 8th Hussar, which chronicled the goings-on in their new home very well. For 6.5 months, the regiment carried on this way, resting and recuperating from years of battle in that idyllic corner of the Netherlands. As with all good things, however, their stay in Eelde would come to an end. After months of waiting, word finally came in November of 1945 that the 8th Hussars were to leave Eelde by the end of the month and return home to New Brunswick. The night of the 26th was their last spent in the village, and it was on that night that the grateful citizens of Eelde bade them farewell. In the town hall, Lieutenant Colonel Bob Ross was given a vellum scroll bearing the village seal and the following message. The Council of the Municipality of Eelde considers that the 8th New Brunswick Hussars Regiment, during the liberation of the Netherlands and during the time afterward that it had been stationed in the municipality, from April 1945 up to and including November 1945, has rendered the municipality special services and has earned special recognition. It has been the decision of the Council to award to the 8th New Brunswick Hussars Regiment the Medal of Honor of the Eelde Municipality in gold. The Council aforementioned, the 13th of November 1945. With this document, the regiment was given a promise that someday, when Eelde had recovered from the horrors of the war and occupation, the municipality would thank the Hussars with a gold Medal of Honor. Impossible that night, since, as the burgomaster put it, the Germans have taken all our gold. It was accepted by Lieutenant Colonel Ross, among the other gifts that were given and received by the town. The people of Eelde gave the regiment, among other things, a flag of friendship, sewn by the Village Women's Association. And a few days before, the regiment, as thanks for the warm welcome they had received, had presented a brass plaque to the local church, where they had held many church parades with record attendance. The plaque had been fashioned from the casing of a 105mm shell fired at the enemy during the war. A banquet followed, and a dance that carried on for the rest of the night and into the next morning. When the Hussars left Eelde for the last time on the 27th, it is said, plenty of their Dutch friends remained to say goodbye. After finally returning home to Canada in January of 1946, there is little doubt that the Hussars had fond memories of their time in the Netherlands, and that they eagerly awaited the day that the promise of receiving the town's Medal of Honor would be fulfilled. For a further 7 years they would wait, but at the height of spring in 1952 it arrived, and one of the regiment's most memorable parades, one that drew 2,000 spectators and was recorded and broadcast internationally by the CBC, took place. It happened on the 25th of May, 1952. The Hussars were assembled in the familiar parade square at Camp Sussex, overhung with elms. From Ottawa came a delegation headed by the ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands himself, Dr. Antonius Hermanus Johannes Lovink, to present the medal. Also present were former OCs George Robinson, Kelty Kennedy, and Harold Gamblin, Victoria Cross winner and Minister of Labour, the Honourable Milton Fowler Gregg, and the widow of the beloved Lieutenant Colonel Bob Ross, who had been OC after the war from 1948 until his death from a heart attack in 1951. It was Lieutenant Colonel Ross who had accepted the scroll from Eilde's burgomaster, and it would no doubt have been he who accepted the medal itself, had he still been alive. Lieutenant Colonel Edmund William George, his successor, would accept it in his stead. The ceremony began with the regiment marching on to parade. The band played rousing music as they marched on before the parade was called to a halt. The chaplain then began to speak and led the parade in a religious service.
Let us join together in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
A prayer was said for the Hussars who had laid down their lives for the sake of liberty, in their own country and in the Netherlands.
And let us pray for those members of this regiment who have given their lives in defense of our land. O Almighty Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, we give thee thanks for all those who laid down their lives for our sakes and who now are at rest.
Following these prayers and the singing of several hymns, Reverend Dr. William R. Flemington, the former principal chaplain of the Canadian Army during the war, and at that time president of Mount Allison University, gave a rousing sermon in which he expressed a wish for the friendship between the Netherlands and Canada to develop into a lasting and fruitful peace.
Yes, and I think again of tulip time in Holland at the cessation of the war, when no longer did the totalitarian boot crush the tulips, but friends moved in, and Canadians and Hollanders fraternized And in memory of that fraternization, we are here today to meet His Excellency, the Ambassador of Holland. God grant that out of all this preparation and defense of peace will come a real and lasting peace.
After the Reverend Flemington concluded his sermon, the band began playing the national anthem of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Het Wilhelmus, to signify the arrival of the Dutch delegation, which included Ambassador Levink, his family, and the Dutch military attaché to Canada. God Save the Queen followed, before the ambassador delivered a speech to the men of the regiment on behalf of the people of Eelde.
General Plow, Brigadier Snow, Colonel George, officers and men of the 8th Princess Louise's New Brunswick Hussars. I consider it a particular honor to have been invited today to present to this illustrious regiment, the 8th Princess Louise New Brunswick Hussars, now known as the 5th Armored Regiment, the Medal of Honor of the town of Eelde in the Netherlands. This medal has been presented to the regiment in commemoration of the gallant part it took in the liberation of the Netherlands in 1945, and as a token of the appreciation and friendship of the population of this small Dutch town where the regiment remained in garrison after the end of the hostilities for about 7 months.
Lieutenant Colonel George then read aloud the letter which the Burgomaster of Eelde had addressed to the 8th Hussars.
This Medal of Honor, it will be remembered, was promised and offered to the regiment by the Town Council of Eelde on November 13th. At the end of the 7-month-long stay the regiment had in Eelde in 1945. It was offered to the OC of the regiment, the late Lieutenant Colonel G.R.H. Ross, as a reward for splendid services the regiment rendered to the Netherlands and the liberation of this country, and as a token of friendship and thankfulness from the population of this Dutch village where the regiment had to live for more than 7 months. And I express herewith the sincere wish of the Town Council of Eelde, and at the same time of all the inhabitants of this municipality, that the good and friendly relations which were established during the time the regiment lived in this town will be prolonged in the future.
When Lieutenant Colonel George finished reading the letter, the ambassador continued his address.
On this day, my thoughts go back to that other month of May, now 7 years ago, when silence fell at last on the battlefields of Europe, of Western Europe, and the Second World War in the West came to an end. The unpredictable vagaries of warfare had brought the 1st Canadian Army to occupied Holland, and to the Canadians fell the task of throwing the enemy out of the country and to restore to the Dutch people the freedom which they cherish most. Many a valiant Canadian men have made the supreme sacrifice, and never again saw the citadel of the maritime port of Halifax looming over Canada's shore.
Many Hussars had been lost in the Netherlands. The ambassador told their living comrades of the way the Dutch took care of them, and how they served as a memorial to the sacrifice they had made.
The still white crosses which stand on these flower-bedecked cemeteries are to us in the Netherlands a constant reminder of the sacrifices which Canadians have made in the defense of freedom and right. Our people always shall hold their resting place in reverent esteem.
Dr. Levink went on to narrate the path of the Hussars across the Netherlands in the last month of the war. They had gone from Arnhem to the IJsselmeer to Delfts Isle, before coming to Eelde at the war's end. He then spoke a few words in Dutch to his own countrymen, before, in the same vein as Reverend Flemington, he expressed his own hope that after the horrors of war had been experienced by so many, a lasting peace may be achieved the world over. It could be achieved, he said, with faith in God and faith in the spirit of freedom. Finally, the time came to make good the promise of the Eelde Town Council from 7 years before.
Now, I will have the pleasure to hand over to your officer commanding your regiment the Medal of Honor, given to you by the citizens of the city of Eelde. As well as for myself, I would like to give you a photo which was made of the wreath Her Majesty laid on the 22nd of May of this year at the foot of the War Memorial.
He then handed the medal over to Lieutenant Colonel George, who thanked him and the people of Eelde for their unparalleled kindness and generosity in those 7 months following the war's end. He promised that the regiment would cherish it, and remarked that the same gratitude shown by Eelde to the 8th Hussars was also shown at a national scale, with Queen Juliana of the Netherlands laying a wreath at the National War Memorial in Ottawa during a recent state visit.
To the people of the municipality of Eelde, and to the people of the Netherlands who are listening to the shortwave broadcast of this ceremony today, I extend, on behalf of all ranks of the 8th Princess Louisa's New Brunswick Hussars, our sincere good wishes. Finally, sir, may I express our gratitude to Your Excellency for your kindness in coming here today, and for the very generous and eloquent tributes which you have paid to the 8th Princess Louisa's New Brunswick Hussars in presenting the Medal of Honor on behalf of the people of the municipality of Eelde, which, because of all the sentiment it symbolizes, will always remain a highly treasured possession of the regiment.
With that, the promise made to Lieutenant Colonel Ross was fulfilled. The citizens of Eelde had shown their gratitude one final time to the men that had done the same to them 7 years before. The Medal of Honor of Eelde was a fitting symbol of that gratitude, and of the spirit of friendship between the people of the village and the 8th Hussars, which continues to this very day.